Welcome to Chess Dog. Today we have a game from the young Tal when he was only 12 years of age. Now, Tal, believe it or not, was not considered to be a prodigy. Even though he won the world championship at the age of 23, he was the youngest in history at the time. He's since been surpassed by Kasparov and Carlsen. They were a little younger. But even though he won the world championship at a young age, he was not considered a prodigy. And in our game today, again played when he was 12 years of age, we see that he is a brilliant attacker. He still has some things to learn. Tal analyzed this game in his own book, Life and Games of Mikhail Tal. He was pretty hard on himself. I think this shows some real brilliance, and I think you'll enjoy the game. He had the white pieces. He's playing a 15-year-old named Zilber. He begins with the move e4, Tal does. His opponent plays e6, d4, d5, knight to d2. We have the French defense, the Tarrasch variation of the French defense. White blocks in his bishop at c1, but leaves his c-pawn flexible. c5, attacking the center. ed5, queen d5, knight gf3. And this is actually a modern main line, but in this position, black takes the pawn at d4 with the pawn at c5. They didn't know as much theory at that time. Knight c6, bishop c4. This is one of the problems now. Black is forced to play the queen to h5. Not the best square for the queen, as we will see. Tal takes on c5. Bishop takes c5, knight e4, and all of a sudden you begin to see Tal getting a pull in this position. He's hitting the bishop on c5. He's sort of tickling that d6 square with the knight, which would be a very bad square for that knight to land on if you have the black pieces. Black responds with knight g to e7. Again, not the best move. He should have played knight to f6 to directly challenge that knight on e4. If the knight takes on c5, the queen could recapture the bishop. He plays bishop to g5, Tal. Tal would have been better off playing queen to e2 here, with the idea of after black castles, play g4, sacrificing that g-pawn, then rook to g1, attacking down the g-file. That's a very modern way of doing things, advancing the g and the h-pawn. He plays bishop to g5, and he's got a trick in mind, and it really is what we today would call a cheapo, and it ends up not working. Black responds with queen to g4, hitting the knight on e4. Tal defends the knight on e4 by playing queen to d3. Black plays b6. And here Tal makes his first real mistake of this game, as he says in his book. He castles long. He just wants to attack, put pressure down the d-file. All that's well and good. The problem is he misses a great opportunity. The opportunity is to trap the black queen. It's not well placed. He should have played h3. And if black responds queen takes g2, then simply rook h2, and the queen is completely trapped on the g2 square. If instead the queen moves to f5, this variation would also work if it played to h5. After queen f5, g4, forcing the queen to g6, then knight h4, and the queen is trapped. If black counterattacks white's queen on d3 with knight e5, white just retreats the queen to e2, and that's it. He wins the opponent's queen. So that was his first mistake, but he castled long. Black castles short, and here's the cheapo. Bishop to f6. He can still play the h3 idea even now, but he plays bishop to f6. The idea, of course, is that if black takes the bishop, knight takes f6, check, wins the queen with a fork. But he misses the old in-between move, the old intermezzo. These in-between moves are very important in chess, and his opponent plays queen to f4, check. And now he has to move his king to b1, and now pawn takes bishop, and the fork isn't there anymore. The queen's not on g4, the f6 square is defended, and at this point, Tal is losing this game. But here we get to see, even though not yet a prodigy, that raw talent for attacking play begins to show itself here. Very impressive. He plays g3 to kick the queen away, queen h6, now g4. What Tal wants to do is open the g-file, move the rook to g1, and attack his opponent's king. Very simple. His opponent moves the queen back to f4, now g5. Now here, simply black should play f5. He should keep that g-file closed. After something like knight f6 check, king h8, maybe knight h5, attacking the queen, queen to c7, queen to c3 check, and if the king moved back to g8, it would just be queen to g7 mate, but black just plays e5. And black is completely winning. But instead, unaware of the danger, black takes the pawn. And now after knight f g5, the g-file is open. Plays knight to g6, h4. He wants to play h5 to kick that g6 knight away so it will no longer block the g file and he can attack down the g file. His opponent plays knight to b4. A much better idea for black is knight c to e5, hitting the queen on d3. Then if queen to c3, simply f6. The knight is defended, the knight at g5 is kicked away, and the diagonal is blocked. Black is just winning again. But he plays knight to b4, white plays queen to h3, and here black plays a move that's always very tempting, you know, the one-move threat. He should play h6 here and kick that knight away from g5, but he plays e5 instead. And it does allow the bishop on c8 to threaten the queen at h3. It's true, but it's temporary. It's a temporary threat. And white just moves the queen to g2, and now the queen is on the g file. And here black makes the critical error. After this move, white is winning, and it seems like a pretty obvious move. Black plays bishop to f5. He should have played, he should have played king to h8 to move off of that g file. But with bishop to f5, now h5, and the knight is kicked away, and the g file is now under tremendous, tremendous pressure. Black has to play king to g7. Let's look at a couple of the alternatives. If black plays knight to h4, counterattacking the queen on g2, black gives up the exchange. Then when the queen takes the rook, knight f3 check is a discovered check. The queen on g2 is checking the king. The knight at f3 is attacking the queen on h4. Say the queen tries to block at g4, boom, knight to f6 check. The same fork that we saw in the earlier variation. The other line, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, king to g7, but then hg6, hg6, and this is a neat tactic. c3 kicks the knight, forces it to c6. Bishop to d5 pins the knight to the rook. The rook moves out of the pin and defends the knight. Everything seems fine. Knight takes c5, and that unleashes the queen and the bishop on the knight at c6. bc5, bishop takes c6, and white is up an entire piece. So instead, black plays the king to g7. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, you can show a thank you by clicking the like button. So white takes the knight on g6, and black, not wanting to open that h file and allow the rook to come into h7, plays h6. And white responds with bishop takes f7. A lot of pressure on the h6 pawn. If he were to take on g5, white just plays rook to h7, checkmate. So the knight cannot be captured. If he plays queen to g4, and if this case, if white plays rook to h6, the queen would just take the rook on d1 and deliver checkmate. But what white does instead is he plays queen to h2, threatening the h6 square. And then when that square is defended, queen to e5, check. You go the other direction, king f8 is forced, and g7, checkmate. Wow. Final idea, knight to c2. Then rook takes h6. The idea is if black plays king h6, then rook h1 check, forces the king to g7, and then still rook h7 mate. So instead of king takes h6, knight to a3 check is the idea. Bishop a3, bishop e4 check, knight e4, and then the queen recovers the rook on h6. The problem is after rook h1, it's still far too much pressure down the h file, and black is lost. So black decides to give up the exchange for the bishop at f7, the best move available. White takes the rook with the pawn. Black takes the knight on g5, knight takes g5, and here black plays queen to f2, a cunning move. He is offering the exchange of queens, which would remove the pressure from black's king. He's also got this little trickery up his sleeve. And remember, you can never relax in a game of chess. Never relax. If white got greedy and takes the rook on a8, watch this. Queen to c2 check, king to a1, queen to b1 check, supported by the bishop, rook takes queen, and knight to c2. The classic smothered mate. You must always be aware of your opponent's tricks. Tal was aware of this trick, so instead he played knight to e6, double check. And when you're in a double check, You cannot capture the checking piece because there's always a second piece also delivering check. So you can only move the king. He takes the pawn at f7, and this is a forced mate from this position. You can try to work it out yourself. I'll give you a second. You can pause it. Okay, here's the forced mate. Queen to g7 check. King takes knight at e6. Rook h6 check. Forced, blocked with the bishop. Queen takes g6 check. King to e7. Rook h7 check. King to f8. And the final maneuver, queen to g7 check. King to e8. Queen to d8. Oh, excuse me, d7 check. The king is forced back to f8. Rook to h8 mate. Mikhail Tal might not yet have been a prodigy, but he was already a genius. An amazing attack from a young 12-year-old Mikhail Tal. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog.